Welcome to WikiPodcast. Today marks the start of our religion series. And for this first deep dive, we're tackling something truly fundamental. We're talking about the very beginnings of religious thought in the human mind. So forget stained glass and scripture for a moment. We're going way, way back to a time before any named gods or, organized worship as we know it existed.
Exactly. We're venturing into the deep, deep history of human experience, that vast epoch before written records. And to understand how this core aspect of, while being human first took shape, we'll be looking at archaeological findings and also seeing what insights we can glean from comparisons with modern hunter-gatherer societies.
Yeah.
Think of it as an investigation into humanity's earliest spiritual stirrings, using the clues our ancestors left behind.
And that's the real challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Trying to piece together such an ancient puzzle, especially when the primary pieces like written accounts are completely missing. So much of what we're going to discuss involves interpretation. And it's important for you, the listener, to know that some of these interpretations are, actively debated.
Precisely. Our mission today is to carefully explore the available evidence. We want to bring to light those fascinating hints about the earliest forms of spiritual awareness and maybe the first expressions of ritualistic behavior in our ancestors.
Trying to uncover these foundational moments without getting too bogged down in sort of overwhelming detail.
Exactly. Okay, so let's unpack this. Where does this journey into the origins of religious capacity even begin? It feels like it must be linked to a pivotal point in our cognitive evolution, yeah?
Absolutely. And what's fascinating here is that the cognitive toolkit necessary for religion, it most likely came fully online with Homo sapiens. That's us, modern humans.
Okay.
Now, some researchers suggest we might see echoes or precursors of ritualistic behavior in Neanderthals. And there's some sparse, often debated evidence for even earlier potential rituals. But the general scientific view, it places the solidification of something we could recognize as religion in the Upper Paleolithic.
The Upper Paleolithic, okay. For those of us without a Paleolithic calendar handy, we're talking roughly around 50,000 years ago. That's when the evidence starts to really coalesce.
Pretty much, yeah. Before that, if we exclude some less certain findings from the Middle Paleolithic, which spans from about 300,000 to 50,000 years ago, the picture is much more fragmented, much more open to interpretation.
Right. And what might this early form of religion have looked like? What are the prevailing ideas?
Well, the leading idea is that early religion was likely shamanic in nature.
Shamanic, so involving individuals, shamans, who would enter altered states of consciousness.
Exactly, presumably to access esoteric knowledge or interact with some kind of spiritual realm.
And a lot of this inference comes from the art, right? The Upper Paleolithic art.
Yeah, that incredibly rich and evocative art.
Those breathtaking cave paintings and the enigmatic Venus figurines.
Spot on. These artistic expressions are often seen as keyholes into the spiritual beliefs and practices of that distant era, suggesting a world where certain individuals sought direct experiences with what they perceived as a spiritual reality.
But before we dive fully into the Upper Paleolithic, it feels crucial to journey even further back to the Lower and Middle Paleolithic periods. What subtle clues, if any, can we find there? Clues that might have paved the way.
The Paleolithic period is just mind-bogglingly vast, isn't it? The time frame is almost beyond comprehension.
Indeed. The Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, stretches from approximately 2.5 million years ago all the way to 10,000 BC. To put that in perspective, that's over 99% of human history.
Wow.
The Lower Paleolithic, so from 2.5 million years ago to 300,000 BC, it doesn't provide us with clear-cut evidence of religious practice. Not really. We do see the development of early hominin collaboration, which is undoubtedly a crucial foundation for the social aspects of later religion.
Sure, social groundwork.
But direct spiritual indicators, they're largely absent.
So where does Australopithecus, our early hominin ancestor, fit into this picture? Were they even capable of religious thought?
Well, Australopithecus is generally considered pre-religious. While some earlier thinkers, maybe back in the 20th century, speculated about potential spiritual awareness, our current understanding of their cognitive capacities suggests they likely lacked the level of abstract thought needed for complex spiritual experiences.
Okay.
However, and here's where it gets really interesting, Some have interpreted the fossil arrangement of the AL333 find. That's where multiple Australopithecus afarensis individuals were found together as potentially representing very early mortuary practices.
Mortuary practices. That early.
It's a controversial idea, definitely.
Yeah.
But it suggests perhaps a deliberate treatment of the dead, which could be a precursor to ritual, a very faint hint.
That's fascinatingly unsettling. What about the evidence we find later in the Lower Paleolithic, those instances of cannibalism with altered skulls? That sounds gruesome, but could there have been a non-nutritional, perhaps even religious aspect?
That is a very sensitive and heavily debated topic. The evidence of cannibalism with modified skulls, for example, with Homo heidelbergensis at Cima de los Huesos in Spain, it has led some to suggest a potentially ritualistic element.
Based on how the skulls were processed.
Yeah, the argument hinges on the specific ways they were processed, which might indicate something beyond just food. However, the prevailing view leans towards either sustenance, just getting calories, or even just the natural processes of how bones decompose and get preserved over such immense timescales. Taphonomy.
Right.
More recent analyses actually suggest that a significant amount of Paleolithic cannibalism was indeed driven by nutritional needs, not ritual.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And what about those incredibly ancient Venus figurines from the Lower Paleolithic, the Venus of Barakat Ram and Tantan? If they are indeed what they seem to be, they could tell us so much about early symbolic thought, potentially even theological understanding.
They are remarkable finds, certainly, though highly speculative. These objects, possibly created by Homo heidelbergensis hundreds of thousands of years ago, they bear grooves that some interpret as resembling female forms.
Very rudimentary, though, right?
Oh, incredibly rudimentary compared to later art. But their potential existence at such an early date raises profound questions. Questions about the origins of artistic expression and potentially the earliest glimmerings of symbolic or theological thought.
But it's crucial to underscore that this interpretation is highly contested.
Absolutely. Whether they are intentional representations, let alone religious icons, is very much up for debate.
So as we move towards the end of the Lower Paleolithic, were there any other developments, any shifts in behavior that might signal a move towards the kind of cognitive complexity needed for religious ideas?
Yes, the late Lower Paleolithic does show us some crucial cognitive and behavioral shifts. We see more consistent and controlled use of fire, evidence suggesting changes in the pace of childhood development, a growing awareness of environmental patterns, the deliberate collection of unusual or striking objects.
Like shiny rocks or something.
Exactly. And the use of pigments like red ochre by both Homo heidelbergensis and even Homo erectus. These behaviors, taken together, suggest a gradual development of symbolic thought, a move towards the kinds of abstract capacities that would eventually be essential for religion.
Like the slow assembly of the cognitive building blocks.
Precisely. The foundations being laid.
That makes sense. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the Middle Paleolithic, the era dominated by Neanderthals and the emergence of early Homo sapiens. Did the picture start to become clearer in this period?
The Middle Paleolithic, from 300,000 to 50,000 BC, is where the discussion about potential precursors to religion really intensifies, especially regarding Neanderthals. Interpretations of their behavior as potentially religious often focus on their use of cave spaces, their burial practices. And notably, the first undisputed burials appear around 150,000 years ago, and they were performed by Neanderthals.
Wow, 150,000 years ago.
Yeah. And also comparisons with ritualistic behaviors we see in modern hunter-gatherer societies living in similar ways.
Neanderthal burials are frequently cited. What specifically about them leads to interpretations of religious belief? Is it just the act of burial itself?
Well, it's intriguing because while elaborate grave goods, those rich offerings we see in later Homo sapiens, burials are generally absent in Neanderthal interments, with the notable exception of that controversial engraved flint from Kizilkoba.
Okay.
We do find evidence of deliberate body treatment.
Like what?
Things like the use of pigments, especially ochre, and placing the bodies in specific flexed positions. And by drawing parallels with modern hunter-gatherer groups, we know that such practices often carry symbolic or ritual significance. Beliefs about death, maybe an afterlife. Some archaeologists, like Brian Hayden, have even suggested that Neanderthal burials could indicate early forms of ancestor veneration or a belief in continued existence.
But there's also the counter-argument, right?
Right.
A more cautious interpretation.
Absolutely. Many researchers emphasize the remarkable stability of Neanderthal material culture. Their tool technologies didn't change much over vast stretches of time.
Less innovation.
Right. Which has led some to suggest that Neanderthal cognition might have been more rigid, and their seemingly ritualistic behaviors, rather than being expressions of abstract spiritual belief, could have served as a more concrete, perhaps even instinctive mechanism.
Like for teaching or social cohesion.
Exactly. Focusing on the correct performance of actions orthopraxy rather than a complex underlying theology or orthodoxy.
What about the old hypothesis of a Neanderthal cave bear cult? That pops up sometimes.
Ah, the cave bear cult.
Yeah.
Yeah, that proposed Neanderthals ritually worshipped cave bears based on finding arranged bear skulls and bones near remains. It's largely been debunked by more recent research.
Oh, really?
Yeah, while bear reverence does appear in some later hunter-gatherer societies in similar cold environments, the simpler explanation for these Paleolithic findings is just the natural overlap in habitat.
So they lived in the same caves, bears died there naturally.
Pretty much. The accumulation of bones happened through natural processes over long periods, not necessarily ritual deposition.
Okay. So where do our direct ancestors, early Homo sapiens sapiens, fit into this Middle Paleolithic picture? Were they showing more overt signs of religious thought than Neanderthals?
Well, initially, during the earlier phases of the Middle Paleolithic, Homo sapiens in Africa don't show a dramatically different picture. Not in terms of obvious religious traces compared to Neanderthals. Their material culture, their tools, weren't particularly suggestive of complex spiritual beliefs at that early stage.
So similar levels of complexity, maybe.
Perhaps, but the Middle Paleolithic is a long and dynamic period, and we do begin to see evidence of increasing cultural complexity later on. Behaviors that hint at ritual, maybe spiritual sophistication, emerging in the later part, roughly between 150,000 and 50,000 years ago. Can you give us some specific examples of these emerging behaviors?
Certainly. There's that engraved flint from the Neanderthal child's grave
Yeah.
at Kizilkoba in Crimea. Deliberate markings that could be symbolic.
Similarly, the association of Neanderthal sites with red pigments, like ochre, and occasional finds of unusual objects like quartz crystals. Some interpret these as potentially symbolic or religiously motivated. Others see them as non-religious practical uses, maybe just curiosity.
Right.
The idea of a proto-religion in Neanderthals has even been suggested. Maybe early mimetic community activities, imitation, shared action served as a foundation for bonding that later evolved into supernatural beliefs.
Interesting.
There's even some speculative evidence, highly debated, mind you, for a potential cult of the sunbird among Neanderthals based on modified golden eagle bones found at some sites.
A sunbird cult. That sounds specific.
Very speculative, based on cut marks on eagle bones, needs much more evidence.
And what about early Homo sapiens, the sapiens before this period we often call behavioral modernity fully kicked in? What were they up to?
Well, before that suite of behaviors fully emerged, early Homo sapiens did show evidence of basic shelter construction, pigment use, collecting unusual artifacts. But they generally lacked the more complex symbolic behaviors we see later in the Upper Paleolithic.
But there were hints.
Yes. Sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, inhabited as far back as 180,000 years ago, have yielded unusual finds. Quartz crystals, deliberately inscribed stones. Some researchers hypothesize these could have been used in very early human rites or held some kind of symbolic meaning.
And the Sodilo Hills in Botswana, they hold such spiritual significance for modern communities there. Does that history stretch way back?
The Sodilo Hills offer a particularly compelling glimpse into the deep roots of spiritual connection to place. It's quite amazing. Even in the Middle Paleolithic, in Rhino Cave, we find evidence of painted spearheads. Some seem to have been transported over considerable distances.
Transported, that suggests value, right?
It does, and they're found alongside these unusual rock formations that are still considered sacred by contemporary hunter-gatherers in the area. This suggests a very ancient, enduring spiritual significance attached to that specific landscape.
Wow.
And then, right at the transition, Middle to Upper Paleolithic, around 50,000 years ago, we witnessed the earliest definitive evidence of cave art using red ochre.
The beginning of art as we know it.
Exactly. This marks a monumental turning point, the start of complex human creative expression, and arguably the dawn of more elaborate forms of religious articulation.
Which brings us neatly to what's often called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. It sounds like a period of truly transformative change.
Absolutely. The Upper Paleolithic, starting roughly 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, was indeed a period of incredibly rapid development. Homo sapiens became the sole surviving human species, and we see this explosion of innovation.
Like what?
Sophisticated tools, the flourishing of art, cave art, portable art sculpture,
Hmm.
personal decoration, long-distance trade networks, more complex living structures,
A whole package of changes.
a whole package. And crucially for our discussion, it's during this period that true, recognizable religion clearly emerges.
And this is where the concept of shamanism really takes center stage in our understanding, doesn't it?
Yes, many scholars see the emergence of organized religious practices in the Upper Paleolithic as closely linked to the development of shamanism. It's theorized as a potential evolution from those earlier, maybe simpler social bonding rituals towards more formalized practices involving things like faith healing, direct engagement with a perceived supernatural realm, often facilitated by individuals entering altered states of consciousness.
Right, the trance states.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
neuropsychological model even proposes that the capacity for shamanic experiences might be a fundamental aspect of human brain function, kind of hardwired.
Huh. And the magnificent art of the Upper Paleolithic, those stunning cave paintings, intricate cordable objects, how do they reflect these shamanic beliefs and other religious ideas?
Well, Upper Paleolithic art is very widely interpreted as holding profound ritual and symbolic significance, though the degree to which all art from this period was inherently spiritual is still debated, naturally.
Sure.
But cave art, in particular, is very frequently linked to shamanistal practices. This is often called the mind in the cave conjecture.
Mind in the cave.
Yeah, the idea suggests that a significant portion of this art was produced during altered states of consciousness, perhaps as a way to document or interact with the spirit world accessed during these trance experiences.
What supports that idea?
Things like the often dreamlike and unnatural imagery, you see these animal-human hybrid figures, the alienthropes, and recurring motifs that some researchers connect to visionary or hallucinatory states.
So those enigmatic therianthropes, the part human, part animal beings,
Yeah.
they might represent shamans transforming.
That's a compelling and widely accepted interpretation, yes. These figures are often understood through the lens of sympathetic magic, maybe rituals for healing, or as representations of ancestral spirits, totemic animals, maybe even early forms of deities. Interesting. And interestingly, while fully human sculptures from this period are predominantly female, those Venus figurines we mentioned,
Right.
the therianthropic figures are almost exclusively male.
What about those ubiquitous Venus figurines then? Their purpose has been debated forever. How do they fit into the religious landscape?
The Venus figurines, those small, handheld statuettes of nude women found across a vast area of Eurasia, they are highly likely to have held religious significance, potentially connected to fertility rites, notions of fecundity, maybe ancestor veneration.
We don't know for sure.
We don't know for sure. Interpretations vary wildly. Self-portraits, charms for survival, representations of a mother goddess, simply generalized symbols of womanhood. But their widespread distribution and certain consistent features strongly suggest a shared cultural and likely spiritual meaning.
And the burial practices. They seem to get much more complex in the Upper Paleolithic, too.
Indeed, we see the appearance of complex burials with what appear to be deliberate and often lavish grave goods. These types of burials seem to have been reserved for certain individuals, suggesting social differentiation.
Social or maybe religious status.
Could be either or both. The continued and widespread use of red ochre in these burials is also significant, often interpreted as symbolizing life or perhaps rebirth.
Any specific examples?
Well, the Lake Mungo 3 burial in Australia, dating back over 40,000 years, the body was covered in ochre that had been transported over long distances. That seems like a significant ritual act.
Definitely. And those incredibly rich Sungir burials in Russia with all the beads.
Ah, Seigneur. Yes, particularly the adult male and the two children interred with thousands, literally thousands of ivory beads, animal teeth pendants, mammoth ivory carvings, ochre. It strongly suggests beliefs about an afterlife, perhaps the importance of social status even in death.
The sheer effort involved.
Exactly. The investment of resources is huge, especially with potential evidence of human weaponry found with one individual. It even hints at specialized roles, maybe shamans.
Right. And the burials often seem unusual.
They do. Many Upper Paleolithic burials have unusual characteristics. Disproportionate representation of males or young people or those with physical differences. Shared tombs. odd body postures, those rich, grave goods. It's led to some more controversial theories, too, things like human sacrifice or special treatment for prominent religious figures like shamans.
So it sounds like the religions of the Upper Paleolithic, with shamans and elaborate rituals, were likely quite different from the faiths many of us are familiar with today.
That's a key point, yeah. Upper Paleolithic religions were likely polytheistic in their understanding of the spirit world, and they seem to have placed a greater emphasis on orthopraxy, the correct performance of rituals and practices rather than orthodoxy, a rigid set of beliefs.
Practice over doctrine.
Sort of, yeah. Shamanism, with its core practice of entering altered states to communicate with spirits, was likely central. But again, it's crucial to remember our interpretation of prehistoric shamanism is based on inferences, from archaeology, from comparisons with modern groups, so it remains a subject of ongoing discussion.
And some earlier ideas, like the cave bear cult or a dominant goddess worship based just of Venus figurines.
Those have largely been critiqued, often debunked. They often lacked broad supporting evidence or tended towards overgeneralization, but they show the continuous effort to understand the spiritual lives of our ancestors.
So what does this all mean, this deep dive into the origins of religion? It reveals a long and incredibly fascinating journey, doesn't it? Stretching from the faintest hints of ritual in our early ancestors to the more complex spiritual expressions of the Upper Paleolithic.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it truly underscores the remarkable ingenuity, the deep-seated human drive to grapple with the fundamental mysteries: existence, life, death, our place in it all. Our ancestors, even way back then, were actively seeking meaning and connection. They left behind these evocative clues that keep sparking our curiosity and ultimately enrich our understanding of what it means to be human.
It wasn't a sudden flash of inspiration, was it? It seems like the development of religious thought was gradual, an unfolding process shaped by so many interconnected factors.
Exactly. This emergence wasn't a singular event. It was this slow, intricate unfolding, profoundly influenced by cognitive evolution, by developing social structures, by the environment itself.
Consider this. Even before the gods and deities we know today took their familiar forms, the human mind was already actively exploring realms beyond the tangible. It was laying the foundational groundwork for the incredibly diverse tapestry of religious beliefs and practices we see across the globe now. What aspects of this incredibly early exploration resonate most deeply with you, listening now? What might these ancient, perhaps innate, human impulses tell us about our own inherent spirituality and our enduring search for meaning?
It's truly remarkable, isn't it, to realize that this fundamental human quest for understanding and connection has such deep roots, stretching back to the very dawn of our consciousness.
Thanks for listening. Write us in the comments your opinion on the episode and what other topics you would like us to talk about. Subscribe to the channel to help us reach more listeners. Thank you, and have an amazing day.